We're pleased to have you for our inaugural virtual Keiki Talk. These are our premier forum for community leaders to come together and learn about issues impacting our Keiki and our families. We often are bringing innovative research, new ideas, things for discussion and debate to the community, often the first ever time we've talked about those things in our state. Previous topics have included things like paid family leave, innovative ways to invest financially in our children, and the impacts of trauma on our kids. As I said, in the past, these have been face-to-face, so this is our first time hosting a virtual forum where we're not sitting together and sipping our coffee. I hope you have perhaps a snack and some coffee with you for this great conversation. Today, I'm happy to start us off for our talk on ending racism, starting with kids, with Dr. Kristin Pauker. Dr. Pauker is an associate professor of psychology at the University of Hawaiʻi and director of the Intergroup Social Perception Lab. She was born and raised here in our state of Hawaii. Her work explores how people's immediate environment and culturally shaped theories about race impact basic social perception, social interactions, and stereotyping in childhood and throughout development. Her research has been widely published in academic journals and featured in the media, including the New York Times, New York Magazine, and Time Magazine. She's been the recipient of a Board of Regents Medal for Excellence in Research and Medal for Excellence in Teaching. Her work has been supported with over $1 million in combined funding from the National Institutes of Health and the National Science Foundation. So we are so pleased to have Dr. Pauker here with us today. Our format for our talk today will be as follows. So I will turn over the mic momentarily to Dr. Pauker, and she has a relatively short presentation for us, about 30 minutes, I believe. During the presentation, we will not be taking questions. So we encourage you to please note those questions that you have as we're going along in the Q&A function at the bottom. And then after the 30 minutes, Ryan from our team will be moderating some discussion and doing the Q&A. So please get your questions ready because the first half will be, it is meant to be interactive in this format as well. So please note down your questions as we go. And without any further ado, I'll turn it over to Dr. Pauker.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, and thank you so much for having me here today. I'm happy to share some of the research that we've been doing as well as others have been doing to tackle this important question. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you. You will see a dog for a moment, and then you should see my slides now. So today I'm going to be presenting some of the research that has been done on how children in Hawaii learn racial and ethnic biases and some thoughts for what we can do about it, how we can help to mitigate some of these biases. So first off, I'd like to start off with talking about the context in which our children are growing up right now. So the increasing momentum of the Black Lives Matter protests this summer really made it abundantly clear that something needs to be done to address ongoing racism. Many educators and parents struggled with how to have these types of conversations about race and racism with their children. Before considering how best to have these important conversations with their children, I think it's important to understand what children know about race and when, and the types of racial biases that they develop. So this knowledge can actually better equip us to think about interventions at both individual and institutional levels that are empirically backed and developmentally appropriate. So first, I'm going to share with you a slide that is relatively busy. There is a whole lot of information on here. What I want to point your attention to is across the top is basically showing different age groups. So starting at 3 to 6 months of years of age, 3 to 6 months, then 3 to 4 years, 5 years, 6 to 7 years, etc. And then along the left-hand side is basically different types of racial knowledge that children gain throughout their development. So before we can figure out how to talk to our children about race, it's useful to know what the research actually tells us about when and how children process race. So the real answer here, if we're asking this question of what do children know about race, is actually, it depends. It depends on the sample of children that you're talking about. It also depends on the social environment that those children are growing up in. But if we're going to take super broad strokes, we can come up with a basic timeline that looks like the timeline you see here. So first to point out, really, some people make the argument of, well, I don't want to start this conversation with my child because, they don't see these things. They don't notice race. They're colorblind. And really the best evidence to counter that argument is, in fact, when we look at the research, children are not colorblind. So as young as 3 months of age, for example, they will look preferentially towards faces of one race versus another race, oftentimes faces that they're more familiar with or that happen to belong to the same group as them. So they show this perceptual discrimination where they can literally see differences between faces that are depicting different racial identities. As children get a bit older, around 3 to 4 years of age, they start to sort based on race. So if you give them, piles of pictures, they will start to sort them into groups that resemble approximately how adults might sort them. But around that time, they're just beginning to start to verbally label themselves. So in terms of their own racial identity and others. And oftentimes they may be inaccurate, at 3 to 4 years of age. Most, again, broadly, if we consider the literature broadly, most are accurate by about 5 years of age, where a child can label other groups of people. This concept of racial constancy is the idea of understanding that someone's race or their racial identity is something that's constant and doesn't change across time. This is somewhat of an interesting concept because in actuality, all of our identities change constantly. But if we're doing this from the perspective of how do children understand different concepts, they start to think around 3 to 4 years of age, but certainly by 6 to 7, that race is something that is often, they will argue, biologically based. It doesn't change. It's something that is internal. The children start to understand race in that way. In terms of this idea of bias, children exhibit explicit biases as early as 3 or 4 years of age. So we start to see this emerge very early, and it continues on where they are exhibiting pretty strong pro-in-group biases, so more positive biases about their own group, up until about 6 to 7 years of age, around 7, and then it actually starts to decline after that, where we see explicit biases start to decline developmentally. And if people have questions, we can talk about what that actually means. We look at another type of bias, implicit bias. This is our biases that are measured with things that are thought to be less susceptible to control. So it's things like the implicit association test, if you've heard of that. We actually see children exhibit implicit biases as young as 3 to 4 years of age as well in preschool. And there's some evidence of relative stability in those biases, but then some evidence of change as children start to get a little bit older. Around 10 to 12 years of age, we actually see declines in implicit biases towards certain groups. And this tends to be groups that a child might have high exposure to in their environment. For example, in this particular set of research, in environments where children had a lot of exposure to Black individuals, and if we're looking at white children, they actually show declines in their implicit bias that involve Black individuals at around 10. In terms of stereotypes, when do kids learn about these associations between traits and groups, we see that is pretty prevalent, at least by 6 to 7 years of age, sometimes a little bit earlier than that. And then the last piece that I want to talk about is this idea of racial identification, understanding discrimination, and racial exclusion. Children are developing a sense of what it means to belong to a particular group, this sense of we-ness, and that real sense of identifying with a particular racial identity, for example, doesn't solidify until a little bit later in childhood, around 8 to 10 years of age, and even after that, into early adolescence. But this is also the time that children are developing a more concrete understanding of what discrimination means, both in terms of what it means to potentially discriminate against another person, but also the sense that their group could be discriminated against, that they could be the target of discrimination, as well as you see increasing racial exclusion around these ages as well. So there's a lot of important caveats here because the research shows there are clear differences in this average timeline based on a number of factors. One of those factors is the racial group membership of the participants themselves. The majority of the research that has been done on white children growing up in predominantly white contexts. And so a lot of the literature is based on that group. If we look at children of color in different contexts, you often see a different pattern where they exhibit less clear in-group biases, for example, and there's more variability in terms of the biases that they exhibit. The other kind of important caveat is what is the high status group in the child's context. So how some of these things emerge differently depending on what group is considered high or lower status in a particular context. And then the last piece of evidence that has been shown to really impact children's biases is the diversity in a child's context. The more exposure you have to different groups, typically that leads to a decrease in stereotyping and bias about those groups. But again, this is talking in very broad strokes. So that gets us to the question of, given what we know about the larger literature about how children develop racial biases, are kids in Hawaii less biased? We know that racial diversity matters in terms of mitigating some of these biases. So this seems like a reasonable question to ask. It's a provocative question to focus on in headlines, for example. This was headlines from my work that was covered in the New York Times. But I really would like to emphasize throughout this talk that it's a complicated issue. And so the issue isn't just are kids in Hawaii less biased. There's a lot more to this, and there's too much to be unpacked in the time that I have to talk about today. But I think a simpler question to ask that helps us understand things a little bit better is, how do kids in Hawaii perhaps think about race differently? And then what can we learn from that understanding? So what are some of the differences that we do see? So the first slide I'm going to show you is children's stereotyping. So differences in their stereotyping across, in this case, comparing Hawaii to Massachusetts. And so these are 4 to 11-year-old children. And we measured both the extent to which they endorse both positive and negative racial stereotypes. So example of a positive racial stereotype, for example, is, do they think Asians are good at math? So how much do they endorse that? This sample included children from Hawaii who, with a relatively diverse sample, so it included white, Asian, Native Hawaiian, and a fairly large group of multiracial individuals. And then the Massachusetts sample, though, was a primarily white sample and had a small representation of Asian and multiracial individuals. So what this graph shows us is, as children get older, children in Massachusetts were exhibiting more and more knowledge of outgroup stereotyping, or outgroup stereotypes, but children in Hawaii were not necessarily increasing in their knowledge of outgroup stereotypes over the same age range. So we're seeing more outgroup stereotyping in the Massachusetts group than the Hawaii group. But again, I'd like to note this does not mean that children in Hawaii don't learn stereotypes. We found that everyone, children in Hawaii and children in Massachusetts, also increased in their in-group stereotyping over this age range. So this would be knowledge of stereotypes about groups that they belong to. So we do find they don't necessarily increase in the outgroup stereotypes, but they are increasing in in-group stereotypes. So another contextual difference that we've looked at is how children label other individuals' racial group memberships. So if you remember back to that timeline that I showed you, the research generally says children are accurate by 5 years of age. They can label other people. And so this study, we were looking at 9 to 13-year-olds. So this is substantially beyond the time that children are thought to be accurate. And we were comparing, in this case, a sample of children from Hawaii to a sample of children in California. The Hawaii sample, again, was relatively diverse with multiracial Asian Pacific Islander children with a smaller proportion of white and Black children. And then the California sample included white, Latinx, multiracial, Asian, and Black children. And so what you're going to see in this graph is children were asked to label a picture, and they saw a picture of a child who was identified as white and a picture of a child who identified as Black. And they, it was a pretty clear picture. It wasn't, there wasn't a lot of ambiguity. So these pictures were both the own child's identification as well as pre-tested, where the children normally could say, yes, that's a white child. Yes, that's a Black child. What we found was that the children in California labeled the child according to what you would expect. So said the white child was white and the Black child was Black about 80% of the time. But the children in Hawaii were more about 50% in terms of their accuracy in this case. And so they were much less accurate in terms of their labeling. This is the average number of words they used to describe the child in terms of their race. So we asked them an open-ended question of how would you describe this child's race? And children in Hawaii were using on average 5 words versus children in California were using on average 1 word. And then finally, we have the extent to which they gave the child a multiracial or multi-ethnic description. So we see this was markedly higher in Hawaii compared to the Northern California sample. And so just to give you what, this is an example of what the pictures look like in case you were wondering. And this is also examples of what the children in Hawaii said. So, they might have labeled the first girl as Chinese and African, the second girl as white, Chinese, Hawaiian, Mexican, the boy as African American, Hispanic, and then the boy as Hawaiian, German. So they're using more words, but they're also bringing more of this emphasis on ethnicity as well into their descriptions. So that's another place where there are some differences, I think, in terms of thinking about the work that we do. A lot of the work in psychology focuses on broad racial categories, whereas children, when you are asking them about race, particularly in Hawaii, are tending to focus more on ethnicity. And so there is some kind of differences between how we measure things and how children are thinking about them. So one thing you might take away from this set of studies, if you just saw the data and didn't have me kind of explaining some of the caveats to you, is that, oh yeah, children in Hawaii are less biased. But that's not the whole picture. I think it really depends on the comparisons you're making and for what purpose. And for me, it's really about learning how context affects how children develop their understanding of race. And that we can look at how Hawaii is different. But then I think what's important is to think about how do we use that information to inform our broader theories and also create more effective interventions, including interventions for biases that do exist in Hawaii. So that includes asking, in what ways is Hawaii not all that different? What are some of the similarities that we see? So the next graph I'm going to show you is data from adults. And so this is a graph of pro-white implicit biases in the US using data collected from millions of white test takers who are taking what's called the implicit association test that is available on Project Implicit, for example. And so this is millions and millions of people. And this is a graph of individuals, the average pro-white bias for each of the different states. And so basically what we can see is that, well, if you average across all the states, on average, about 70% of the individuals show a pro-white bias. So pro-white in this case would be a number above 0. This graph also is showing the average for each of the states as well. And so red numbers are higher bias, and blue numbers are a little bit lower bias, right? Darker blue is lower. And so, yes, you can say, Hawaii is kind of on the lower end of the spectrum, looking across all the states. But I think what's important to point out is, on average, Hawaii still has a pro-white bias, and that's indicated by the positive number there. And so this data is based on one particular measure, the IIT, which has received some public criticism for various reasons that I'm not going to go into. But that caveat aside, I think this shows us that it's at least one piece of evidence that, at least among white adults in Hawaii, certain types of biases do persist. So one question is, where does implicit bias come from? How do children and adults form these biases? So first, our brains quickly and effortlessly sort words and people into us and people into us and them categories. We do this according to many different social categories, among which race is one of them. And our brain organizes information this way. So as part of this categorical processing, we tend to form more positive associations with groups we belong to. And we can even quickly form implicit biases around even meaningless categories. So in one study, for example, the researchers assigned the children into meaningless groups. They said, you're in the green group, or you're in the red or orange, whatever color that is, red, I think, group. And you're going to put on this shirt and you belong to this group. Within minutes, the children already formed implicit biases towards the group they were assigned to. So if they were assigned to the green group, they showed higher pro-green implicit biases on an IAT after assignment to that group. So this shows us that human cognitive machinery is ready to form biases based on group membership, and it does so based on input from the environment. In this case, assignment to a group that is now your group. The second thing we know about how implicit biases develop is patterned associations in our social environments actually are input for these biases. So implicit biases are thought to largely be based on cultural associations that we are steeped in from birth to adulthood. And so cultural associations are repeated pairings of certain social groups with certain traits, evaluations, positions in society, jobs, occupations, etc. And so children are really good at tracking all of this information and picking up on patterns that they see. So for example, within the Hawaii context, certain groups are stereotyped as less smart than others. So for example, in a recent study that we did with 12 to 14-year-olds in Hawaii, we found that Pacific Islanders were stereotyped as less smart than white individuals among these children. So this is a clear stereotype that exists in our environment, and children are learning it. But how are they learning it? What are the things that are, in effect, teaching them these particular stereotypes? So oftentimes when we think about how our biases or stereotypes taught, we think about, a parent, who's biased, basically telling their children, biased things and telling them, these explicit stereotypes. And a lot of what we know from the research is that yes, that could influence how children develop some of their biases and stereotypes for sure. But oftentimes parents aren't doing that. Oftentimes they're not explicitly telling their children these things. And so children actually are picking up on a lot of cultural stereotypes from information, this patterned information that they see around them. So they may learn stereotypes, for example, from more subtle associations that are presented in their social environment. So in one study, what we looked at, for example, was the impact of teachers and teachers' nonverbal behaviors. So one piece of patterned information that children rely on is nonverbal behavior. And in in a child's classroom, for example, they see quite a bit of, how is a teacher acting towards this child or that child. And we do know when a child enters a school setting, teachers have a really big influence on their lives. They provide children with all kinds of information, including feedback about their own abilities. So we know from quite a bit of research that teachers tend to be more positive in their interactions with children that they think are more intelligent. So classic studies on expectancy effects show that children who can pick up on what teachers think about them in terms of their abilities from nonverbal behavior, for example. But what's interesting is, what about the other children that are in the classroom? So if this teacher, for example, is treating the child on the right hand more positively than other children, and somehow that's patterned on group membership, what do the other children think? What do they learn from that information? Could a child pick up on stereotypes merely based on how a teacher treats other children who belong to social groups? So this is the question that we asked in a recent study. So can children learn stereotypes from teachers' nonverbal behavior? These were children who were 5 to 8 years of age in Hawaii. And because children oftentimes have quite a bit of knowledge of stereotypes about different groups, we wanted to explore this in a context where they would have no stereotypes about a particular group coming into the lab. So we created a world where there were children who were in orange t-shirts and children who were in green t-shirts. And then we had children come into the lab and they themselves were put in a t-shirt. So we assigned them now group membership. And then they saw a video of a teacher who was, for example, treating other children in the green group more positively than other children in this orange group. And so they themselves saw how the group they belonged to was treated. So they could have been in a condition where they were assigned to a group that was treated positively or negatively. After seeing those videos, then we asked them some questions about new kids who belong to this green or orange groups. And we asked them, for example, who do you think is smarter? Who do you want to be friends with? So the child sees a whole bunch of videos, and this child picked up on, like, she's acting negatively to the oranges. And so the children pick up on these patterns just based on the nonverbal behavior. So what we wanted to see then is, which group do they think is smarter? Which group do they want to befriend? So on the y-axis is the proportion of the in-group selections, so the extent to which they are selecting their own in-group in these cases. So if the green group was treated more positively and they were assigned to the green group, so I'm assigned to the green group and my group is treated positively, we see that they think their group is smarter, they think that the green group is smarter, and they're more willing to befriend others who are in the green group. If they're assigned to the group where their group got negative treatment, in the sense that the teacher was directing negative nonverbal behavior to other children who were also in that orange group, we see that the children actually are not selecting orange group members as smarter. They're selecting green group individuals as smarter. So they're picking up on information that the teacher must think that the other group, the green group, is smarter, and they're reporting that. So they are learning this stereotype. And they're also not showing an in-group preference in terms of their friendship patterns, so that they are equally likely to want to befriend an orange group member or a green group member. But you can see how this could have consequences for individuals who belong to negatively stereotyped groups. So even if a teacher isn't intentionally trying to stereotype a group, they might be unintentionally communicating information about stereotypes to children based on things like patterns in their nonverbal behavior. And then if you belong to a group that's negatively stereotyped in this context, you could see how that could have consequences for a child in terms of their motivation or achievement in school. So the last segment of this is just, what can we do? So now that we've seen that there are similarities and differences in terms of Hawaii's context, and what we know about how children develop biases, what do we do in this case? So I think something important that comes out of all of this research is that children's contexts matter, their social environments matter, and they pick up on information in their social environments. So one thing we can do is to be cognizant of the social environments that we're placing our children in. One concrete thing is to emphasize valuing diversity rather than colorblindness in a child's environment. So there's quite a bit of research that colorblind approaches can be harmful, particularly for children of color. They can be demotivating. And in our own work, we find, for example, that adopting a value diversity approach compared to a colorblind approach, children are more likely to detect discrimination when it happens and do something about it. So it also is valuable in terms of thinking about interrupting bias. I think it's important to increase counter-stereotypical representations in children's environments. And so this points to the idea that they're picking up on patterned associations. And so if they see patterned associations with stereotypes that are kind of weaved into them, they're going to pick up on those stereotypes. So really kind of thinking about the associations that you are exposing children to, either as a parent or as a teacher, in the broader context of the school and the institution itself. And then finally, to encourage conversations about race among teachers and parents. And what does that look like? That's a kind of a broad recommendation. So we do know that parental conversations are really important. Children learn just as much information from your silence and nonverbal behavior as they do from what you say. So if you avoid talking about race, children are going to pick up on that. If you're really uncomfortable with it, they will also pick up on that. So it's kind of an impetus for us to get comfortable with these conversations. Where would I start? So children are searching for explanations in the world around them. And they really are just trying to understand what they see. So you want to think about some sort of simple explanation that you're comfortable with. Explain that people have all different kinds of colors of skin. Sometimes children will point out children who look different than them. Use that as a teaching moment. Try not to avoid these conversations. And you really want to try to think about what might be developmentally appropriate for the child, which we can talk more about if people have questions about that. Really try to emphasize the value in diversity when you might have these conversations. So talking about how, the people's differences are something that is valuable, that is something that's important and something that we value as a family, for example. And then I think the one thing that is often probably the hardest thing for people to do is conversations actually about stereotyping and prejudice itself. Oftentimes parents shy away from these types of conversations because they don't want to teach their child stereotypes that they don't know, or make it so that they're more prejudiced. We do see that children are learning this information anyways. And so I think it's important to have some of these direct conversations, particularly if you see something that happens, being able to call it out and discuss what you saw and challenge it. I think the really important thing about this, though, is to emphasize that prejudice can change. Oftentimes we talk about prejudice as something that's in a person. We emphasize, bad people who are racist and not wanting to do that. But that actually can not help children, because then they feel like, well, if someone's racist, how do I get better? Or how do I change? How do we improve things? And so we have some recent research that shows that actually when you talk about prejudice as a fixed thing, it can actually demotivate children from engaging in these issues. And so it's really important to think about how prejudice is something that can change. And so the last thing I'd like to leave you with is thinking about some broader policy level or institutional changes that can be implemented. We really cannot address systemic racism by only targeting individual biases. We need to think about biases that exist in our policies or our laws, or in the institution that maybe we belong to, and the practices that we have. And so institutions do need to do self-assessments of the ways in which their own policies and practices can increase inequitable outcomes. I think it's really important to do this with data. So to be able to look at, collect data if you can about some of the things you care about, to adopt practices that are known to help students from negatively stereotyped groups. So there's quite a bit of research on some things that have been shown to be useful in terms of interventions for groups that are negatively stereotyped. So for example, growth mindsets about intelligence have been shown to help mitigate academic achievement gaps that we see in some schools. Also, belonging interventions are another empirically based intervention that have been shown to be effective. We also want to consider leveraging things that are important for children. So children's peer networks are really important for them, and social norms are really important. We find that interventions that leverage this, for example, teaching a child who is perhaps has a lot of connections in a social network is seen as an influencer, teaching that child, giving them tools to interrupt bias can actually lead to greater change at a school as a whole, because the children who have a lot of influence are influencing the social norms. And then finally, the idea that you could create research or community partnerships. Oftentimes researchers have a lot of knowledge of the existing literature that could help inform solutions, and community organizations have a lot of knowledge of the community and the particular issues that exist in their community. And so those partnerships can be really valuable in terms of thinking about ways to implement interventions and test them, and collect data, and be able to analyze it. And so I'd like to end there. I kind of went a little over in my time. Thank everyone who's participated in this research. And then there's some additional information if people are interested in learning more about some of the research that we do. But I do want to get to questions, and I will stop there.
Well, thank you so much for this wealth of knowledge. You covered a lot of ground in half an hour, so thank you so much for going over all that research. We had a couple questions about implicit bias. Maybe if you could just sort of give us like a really quick definition for those who maybe aren't familiar with the term, or contrast it to what is explicit bias versus implicit.
Yes, so explicit bias is basically bias that someone is willing to report. So I might ask a child, which child is the nice child? Which child is the mean child? And they will explicitly say, that's the nice child, that's the mean child. So it's a bias that we are aware of and that we can explicitly report. Implicit bias is bias that's often measured in a way where it reveals that you might have a preference for a particular group or a stereotype about a particular group. It can measure both stereotypes and preferences. But you may not be aware that it's measuring that in the task itself. It's often something that's harder to control. It's not that it's not controllable, but it's harder to control, and thought to be something that happens relatively automatically and quickly. So as an example, I'm a female scientist, but I might take an implicit association test that's measuring male scientist, female homemaker, for example, or yeah, let's do that one. Male scientist, female homemaker. And I might be quicker to associate female and homemaker together than female and scientist together. And so I might hold this implicit association. Even though I'm a female scientist, I'm still influenced by that pattern association that I'm going to more strongly associate female and homemaker, for example.
Thanks. So a question, I'll just read the question. So most of the early part of this talk was focused on prejudice and stereotyping as individual pieces. Any thoughts on how to talk with kids about systemic racism as they grow older, and how those individual biases translate into larger power struggles? For example, my child is being taught at school that police officers come to catch bad guys, and we know in our family that it's not that simple.
Yeah, that's a really, really great question, and a complicated one. I think in terms of talking about some of the structural inequalities that exist, not as much research has been done on that in terms of how to do that in an effective way with kids. There's some recent research that started to do that, a researcher called Rizzo and Killen have done some work on kind of kids' understanding of these more complicated structural biases. So there are ways to talk about that with your kids. I think it's also in those particular circumstances with like police officers, for example, right? Talking about, okay, that, that's what you've heard in this circumstance. Could we think about other things that might influence a police officer? We think about other things about how the police operate that might influence, particularly, I think the best thing is to come up with a concrete example if you can, like of a situation, and then talk about various ways to interpret that particular situation. So try to be as concrete as possible with an example, and then try to help your child think about different ways to interpret that same situation. So we can interpret it in terms of an individual autonomy. We can also interpret it in terms of, might there be other things that are influencing that situation, and talk about the external forces or larger differences in power that have existed that could influence that, which again, those conversations often are easier to have as children get a little bit older, like 8 to 10, because they can understand the idea behind power differences and different people having different interpretations of a situation. They can understand some of those more complicated nuances. But there is some research that's showing that you can talk about it in a little bit more simplistic terms with younger children.
And maybe we can, if you have any links to those, we can send those out as well afterward too. So a question about how the kids who were participating in the studies, how were they selected? Were they from, in particular, public schools, private schools, churches, any like homeless or kids experiencing homelessness, things like that?
Yeah, so as in, I think most research that is done, there's some aspect of self-selection where at least a child's family is willing to participate in the research. A lot of the studies, though, we do kind of work with the community and community organizations. So there's a couple of community organizations that serve children from a variety of backgrounds. So including children, both in public and private schools, including children, who may be seeking services for various things. Those children, if their parent has consented, are all included in the research. My guess is we don't have a lot of children who, may be houseless, for example, in our samples, just in terms, but so that's certainly a weakness. But there is variety in the children who, at least in some of the later studies, who participated in our research. And we do, kind of community outreach where we go to various booths and kind of share and talk about, come do science. But there obviously is self-selection.
Okay. A couple questions on the, what can we do about this? So there is a specific question about what are belonging interventions?
Yeah, that's a great question. So belonging interventions, so there's been quite a bit of research that shows that one barrier that particularly stigmatized children who have been stigmatized in terms of academic performance face when they're in school is a sense that they don't belong, that there's some uncertainty about that they, belong in that particular space. And so there have been some interventions that basically try to target that and undo it. So they basically, for example, might share videos from children who are similar to them, who talk about how, when I first got here, I felt like I, had trouble fitting in, but over time that changes. And I found that, I could fit in. And so kind of these narratives of yes, that kind of, it's natural to not feel like you always fit in, but that changes and gets better. And they found that and then also children kind of write about, things that help them feel like they belong. And this kind of change in perspective of, it's natural to maybe not fit in, actually makes it so that they interpret cues of not fitting in that environment as something that's not about them. It's not about their identity. It's not about them. There's not something wrong with them. And they actually then are show increases in motivation for, in terms of their academics and after those types of interventions.
Okay, thanks. Due to teachers, I'm reading this question, due to teachers having such a big influence on kids' perception of race, biases, stereotypes, would you say that DEI work needs to happen in schools? And I think by DEI, they mean diversity, equity, and inclusion. Should this framework be implemented from the state level, or should it come more from parents or parent associations?
My personal opinion is that yes, DEI work should be implemented, but it's difficult, right? It's difficult because you're going to get pushback from different people who may or may not think that that's the appropriate approach. And so, it'd be lovely if it was implemented from a state level. Whether that would actually happen, I don't know, right? So maybe it does have to be coming from parents and parent advocacy groups.
I think you touched on this a little, but there's a concept of like implicit bias training for adults, of course. Is there any research on the effectiveness on that kind of training, especially because it's something that I know a lot of people have been talking about?
Yeah, so there's research broadly on the effectiveness of kind of bias training. There's a big meta-analysis done by an economist that shows, for example, that oftentimes these types of trainings are not effective in isolation. They can be effective when they're combined with other things. So if we take implicit bias training, for example, it's good at raising knowledge about bias, like getting people to recognize that they have these biases. But so for example, if we did implicit bias training within a company, that company still might have structures that are going to encourage decision-making that could rely on those implicit biases, or certain ways that they conduct business that are essentially going to enable continued inequities. So even if you address those implicit biases, it's not going to matter, right? The structures are reinforcing those implicit biases. So it's not just about training the individuals, but also changing the structures. In terms of more effective, if it's combined with other things, like you have created people who are responsible for looking at diversity initiatives within your company, those two things combined together and having responsibility for that can help. It's just like you can't do one and then think that it's going to be better.
Yeah, that makes sense. But at the same time, of course, there are things, individual things that we can still be trying to do. One question is, if there's one takeaway for parents to implement starting today, they said no matter the age of the child, what should that be? For example, emphasize diversity.
I think really just thinking about the ways in which you model these things in your life, right? So I could be, really gung-ho about promoting diversity, but if I don't have diversity in my friends, I don't read diverse books to my child, so it's not just about kind of what you want, but what are you doing in terms of your behavior that you're enacting. And so I think the important thing is children pick up on all of these things. They are really, really paying attention and picking up on patterns. And so if you want to kind of improve and mitigate some of the biases that they're bound to develop, it's about doing so in an active way. And it includes having those conversations with your kids, particularly when they come up, but sometimes maybe proactively when they don't, your kids do understand a whole lot more than you think they do. And the other piece of that for me too is when you talk about prejudice as something that can change. I think that's the part that we often are missing, where we were like, oh, well, but there's prejudiced people and you're not one of them, so it's okay. Well, it's like, no, you might have bias And that's okay. And we want to work on that.
And how about for example, teachers or childcare providers, more in a classroom setting? Is there sort of one key thing that they can start doing today?
I would think about, what does your curriculum look like, particularly in comparison to the group that you're serving in your school? What are the messages that curriculum might be sending based on the representation of the people, who are considered heroes, for example, or, so think about some of those patterned associations and kind of interrogate them critically in terms of thinking about what you're presenting the kids with.
Okay, and one last question, unless we have any more audience questions, but we have, I know, a good number of decision makers or organizational leaders or maybe policymakers at some level who might watch this. Are there is there something like one takeaway for them that they should be thinking about as organizational leaders?
I think that implementing change certainly starts from the organizational leaders. So you have to want that change within your organization. So that includes making that messaging very clear in terms of your organization, not only in your mission statement, but then in terms of, okay, then what are the things you're going to do to address that? So I think one thing that we've seen a lot of lately is, as soon as the summer hit, everyone was posting their kind of statements about Black Lives Matter. And for me, then it was like, okay, but then what are you going to do? Like, how are you going to address that? Like, how are you going to take a look inwards to see what are the things that you may be doing well, not doing so well, and then think about how do we measure that and what are the things we want to improve, and then how do we target improving it? So really kind of backing up again, this emphasis with trying to enact change, I think.
Well, we have just a minute left, so I wanted to just ask, if families want to sign up to participate in the research, what's the process look like for that? Are you doing any research right now?
We are doing research right now, but not any research with families and kids right now, mainly because of COVID. But it will open up again in the future. So if you are interested, you can always sign up now, and then we'll contact you when a study is available. That sign up process is, I included a link in that last slide that I had. It's also available on my website, and you would just go in and put in your information. That gets put into a sheet for us, and then we'll reach out to you to talk about possible study opportunities when they come up.